Hello, and welcome to this presentation as part of the Around the World seminar series put on by KES and the University of Alberta. My name is John Simpson. I'm here to talk to you, of course, about big data. The title of my talk is An Alliteration on Big Data. I'm here as a digital humanities specialist with both the University of Alberta and with Compute Canada. When we think about big data, one of the important things to do is to begin to understand big data. And we can begin to understand big data with what we might refer to as 5 W's of big data. And these are the standard questions that we ask about a lot of things: the what, the why, the where, and the hows. So I'll go through this presentation and I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So what is big data? Why should we care about it? Where does it come from? And how do we crunch it? Something I'm not going to spend too much time talking about, but I will mention here, is the when of big data. And this is something I'm not going to spend a lot of time on because, well, there's sort of two answers and they're in flux. One is, well, we already have big data, right? And this will become clear when I start talking about what big data is. It's something that's with us now. And it's also something that we will never perhaps achieve. So between we have big data now and we can never master it, and well, we might master big data at some point in the future, but perhaps not. We're caught in between these two. Every time we talk with some of these questions, I'll talk about them generally, but I'm also going to talk about them with a little bit of focus on a humanities perspective. What is big data? Well, I have a quote here that comes from Burroughs, but originally from Borgman, but I have it here. I found it in a piece by Burroughs that draws our attention to thinking about big data in terms of the humanities. And it says that although the size of the humanities data may not reach the petabyte scale of the sciences, the digital information landscape for the humanities is characterized by proliferating digital resources and so on. In short, it's trying to say that big data is not just about size, but also about complexity. So when we think about big data, we think about it being defined in two ways, either by absolute size or by relative complexity. So the absolute size approach is easy to understand. If we have something over a certain size or has a certain property, then we can say that it's big data. But not all data is going to meet this standard, and over time, we'll eventually overcome it. And so this is what I meant by sometimes thinking about data shifting and what it means for big data to shift. The definition on the screen right now is a relative size approach, and it's a little harder to understand because it suggests that there's always big data, but we may never have control of it. Because what big data is always just on the outside, just on the fringes of what we're able to do, or maybe just overlapping briefly with those fringes. And once we can master it, it's no longer big data, it's just the data of the past. When we think about big data and how we define it, people often talk about the V's of big data. Typically, we think of at least 3 V's for big data, right? We think about volume, we think about velocity, and we think about variety. And these 3 V's go back to a report that was put out by the Gartner Group in the early 2000s. IBM has a new spin on this, and it's the 4 V's that people are usually throwing around. They add veracity to this mix. But there's a lot of other V's floating around out there, and it doesn't take much searching to find them. They include variability, visualization, value, validity, viscosity, and viability. Perhaps even more that you've come across that I haven't listed here. The point of these is that big data is beyond what we can currently handle or handle well with our tools. And so this suggests that perhaps big data, this goes back to that relative perspective on what big data is, can change depending on the discipline that we're part of and the tools that are available, as well as perhaps the data that's even available. So why care about big data? Well, first off, we're going to care about big data because it allows us to see where we could not see before, right? We want to see and we want to do things that we couldn't otherwise do. Well, this is a standard sort of reason to care, and I'd like to flag here a humanities perspective, a perspective from hopefully a place of critical thought, another reason we should care about big data. And we should care about it because it's currently the big thing. It's not that we should care about it because it's the big thing, but because we know that big things have a tendency to blind us to their consequences. So the quote on the screen is from Boker, and I originally found it in Boyd and Crawford. And it says this: raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. To the contrary, data should be cooked with care. And so this goes to the big thing of big data and not being blinded to big data. because we need to be aware all the time about where big data is coming from and how we are processing that big data. Because the consequences of what we do with that data and how we find that data and what we tell other people are going to have some significant impacts, because big data is currently a big thing and we can influence a lot of people, we can influence policy, and ultimately we can change ourselves and perhaps the way we think and what we do. There are some C's of big data. And these are the things that we want to look for. These are the things where we try to see where we could not otherwise. And so they're going to include connections, consequences, conditions, and contradictions. So when we have big data, one of the things that we're interested in doing with it now is seeing how individual items of that data relate to each other. What is the strength of those relations? Can we see groups or formations that we could not have seen otherwise? We're interested in the consequences of the big data, or the data that composes the big data. Given this new information that we have, given that we can see it in a way that we have not seen it before, so what? What's coming next? Can we make predictions? Can we draw conclusions from this? We're also interested in conditions. So what is it that makes it the case that this data exists? Under what possibilities or under what conditions would it continue to exist? And then if we start to ask the when would it not exist, we are interested here in contraindications or contradictions. So what is it that isn't there? Big data can sometimes enamor us, given its size and the variety and all the other properties that it may have. But one thing we need to keep our eye on is what is not included, or what does it tell us is not the case, as opposed to what is the case. And this is very important as well, because if we don't pay attention to it, we can start following spurious tracks and ask the wrong questions and be led to, well, things that are less than ideal in terms of our outcomes. Next question we might ask is, where does big data come from? Well, you're seeing the same quote from Boker again here, right? Raw data is both an oxymoron and a bad idea. To the contrary, data should be cooked with care. And I'll use this quote a second time because when we ask where big data comes from, we need to keep in mind that the sources of big data always pass through us as filters. We're making choices about what we're selecting to include in our big data sets, or we're making choices about what to produce as big data and the models that will make those productions. So when we think about where big data comes from, I'm going to suggest that there are two C's, or at least two C's for big data. The first one is collection. We go out in the world and we find information and we collect it, we gather it, and when we gather a lot of this, hopefully it gets to a certain size, volume, veracity, and so on, that we might consider it big data. And hopefully it will let us see things that we have not seen before, that we could not see before. But in that collection process, we must keep in mind that we have made choices all the way through about what to keep, what to throw out, how to represent that information, right? How to label it. And so there are things that are left behind, and we need to keep that in mind, and we have been very careful about what we've chosen. So we often collect data. The other C here is conjuring. And I don't mean to be insulting by using this term. I just mean it in a friendly, playful way. So there is data that we make up. We make it up with the best of intentions. We make it up often with very particular formulas and mathematical models and good scientific reasons. But at the end of the day, when we're producing data, perhaps through simulation, whether it's agent-based or otherwise, what we're doing is producing data. And that data is hopefully a reflection of our understanding of the world or whatever it is that we're interested in exploring. But it's a model, and it may not be perfect. And the fact is, it probably isn't perfect. There will be exceptions. And so we need to keep these in mind as well. So where does big data come from? It's either things that we've gathered from the world or things that we have produced, usually representing the world. Now, some of you will start to see that there's some overlaps between the two of these, and perhaps this is a false dichotomy. And that's a good thing to note. The thing to take away from this is that we are responsible for the selection and the production. And so we are a filter, and we need to be aware of the things that we use to filter. So how do we crunch this big data? We have a sense of what it is, we know where it comes from, but once we have it, what do we do with it? Well, it's big data. And so if we take that relative definition, big data is information that's on the fringe of what we're able to handle. The answer to this is really we process it any way that we can. Typical techniques include parallel processing. Sometimes we'll jam it into relational databases. Currently, we have a new other thing or trend that's taking hold, and that's non-relational databases. We'll try to model it, we'll try to simulate it, we'll push it into Hadoop or Spark, and sometimes, a lot of the time, we crunch big data by not crunching it. And so that's a bit of a negative answer, and it just says it's data that we can't handle right now, and so we set it aside and we ignore it. And again, this is a choice that we make. Not all big data is something that we can handle right now. And also, not all big data that we can handle is data that we can handle well. And so we need to make a choice. So there are some S's of big data, ways that we can process data. And so these include things like searching, sorting, sifting, and simulation. Missing from here is statistics, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So those processes that I mentioned earlier, parallel processing, Hadoop, and so on and so forth, they often break down into these categories. So we're searching for very particular pieces of information, and there's different ways to carry that out. There are times we want to sort it. We want to divide the data up into groups so that we can look at those groups individually. We'll often want to sift or filter the data so that there's data, again, that's left out, data that we choose not to look at or include. Simulation is important because when we want to know what the data tells us, we only have one particular instance. We have a snapshot of the world as a whole or at large, but it's only one world. And we want perhaps to ask questions about what could be, what might be. And to do this, we need to produce models. We need to actually do some simulation. And so simulation is sometimes a way that we can crunch big data, because if we can have a model that works in simulation, perhaps we can then iteratively refer it back to the data itself, and we can feel that we understand it more and hopefully actually understand it more. Missing from here is statistics, and that's definitely a way that we process big data, and it could probably have its own slide. It just doesn't. Important to note with statistics, and as we process big data, is that there's an important distinction to be made between descriptive statistics, and these are the sorts of statistics we can produce when we have a high information density. We're very confident that we have enough information from a select group that we can make measurements and we can make predictions, and we can do this with high accuracy. In this way, the statistics are telling us what is the case or what will be the case with a high degree of certainty. But there's also inductive statistics, and this applies a little bit more directly to big data because big data often comes with low information density. This is one of the reasons that IBM added veracity to the original 3 V's of big data: volume, velocity, and so on. With the inductive statistics, we're making educated guesses. We're trying to make smart inferences. And so we use statistical tools to do this, but the certainty with which we can do it is less because the volume of the information in terms of its density is less. And so we're making more of an educated guess. We've talked about big data, where it comes from, why we should care about it, how we crunch it. I'd like to leave you with these things and leave you with one last thing to remember. And again, this is the Boker quote, right? There's no such thing as raw data. All the data is cooked, and we must make sure that it is cooked with care. We have a lot of responsibility with big data because it's the big thing right now. Some other things that we can take away from this and extract from this quote is that data and analysis, they don't tell us what to do, right? They just give us some information. At the end of the day, we must still exercise judgment. And if we don't exercise the judgment in preparing and analyzing our data, then we'll be less prepared to exercise judgment in terms of what to do with it. It is rarely the case that the data tells us what to do, even though we'd be very, very tempted to pretend that it does. We have to remember as well with big data that correlation, right, which is something that big data provides in, well, large quantities, is not causation. It just shows us potential connections and relationships. We shouldn't take big data, except in special circumstances, as being a substitute for good scientific random trials and the like. And the last thing that we can extract from this quote, and just knowing a little bit more about big data, is that big data can't show us the consequences of big data. We can't see the consequences that are going to come from our use and our production and our use and our production and our use and production of big data, in terms of privacy, in terms of ethics, in terms of the things that we'll know, in terms of the actions that we'll take because of the things that we know, just how we will change our behaviors and our habits, how we will change the policies that shape our government. These are all things to come. In order to see these, we're going to have to live through big data and become comfortable with it. And we'll do that by remembering that all data is cooked, and we must make sure that it's cooked with care. Thank you.